We were on the cusp of a stay-at-home order that would extend beyond sanity when a year-old newspaper mysteriously showed up and announced part of my destiny. An icy blast wakes me. It blows across a field of frosted grass and comes right against the glass of our own front door. Reluctantly, I rise and start a pot of coffee. The national news has barely begun whispering warnings of an approaching pandemic. I want to hibernate, but instead take a few steps downstairs to say good morning to the man who is still our guest. He hands me a year-old newspaper which whispers of news already gone by. Just last night, I received news of my Aunt Bee's death, but now this morning, this cold morning in January 2020, I find myself reading a different woman's obituary. It's a page of news from a year-old newspaper that no one else in the world is reading anymore. No one else but the man sitting beside me. The world has gone on and forgotten her small but bold typeset name published on the page, now yellowed. But this man sitting beside me hasn't. He hasn't forgotten how his whole world changed with the news of his mother's death, especially since she had cared for him for over 50 years. My husband and I had welcomed this man into our family last year to provide the care and support he needed. This almost senior with Down syndrome had lived his whole life with his mother, and suddenly, after her death last spring, there was no family left who could take care of him. So we had said yes. And now this morning, as my Aunt Bee is joining her sisters in heaven, one being my own mother, this man with slurred speech and slow tongue was still our foster guest and was handing me his year-old newspaper. I looked into his moist eyes and then at the newsprint portrait of his mother on the printed page now in front of me. His mother's bright eyes seemed to be looking right back at me. After receiving the news of my own aunt's death, I had been feeling like I had just lost another piece of my mother. Unknown to him, that's when he had called me over to share a piece of his own lingering grief. Of course, I had known the man's mother had died last spring, but what I hadn't known until this morning, until holding this old newspaper so close to me after yesterday's news, was that his mother had died on my sister's birthday. We were spring babies, my sister and I. We had that in common. My aunt and my mother, sisters too, were alike in some ways and very different in others. They each had struggled with mental illness to differing degrees, and they each had hearts of gold. My mother was married to the same faithful man for her whole life long, but my aunt's husband was not faithful and did not want to have and to hold her for long. And she became grandmother to a little girl with Downs. So this year-long guest of ours, with a syndrome of his own, had pulled out his mother's obituary and wanted me to see it this morning of all mornings. He had dreamed of her last night. I took time to look into his eyes. He missed her deeply. Our lives started blurring together over a year ago, and it had been a long year for my husband and I. Making separate lives get joined together is no easy task. In marriage, it is the commitment of a lifetime to stay together. In becoming foster parents, it requires the commitment of wanting to be a forever family for a child that needs a roof with room enough for his heart. and it is a commitment of another kind to foster a special needs adult who is still a child in many ways himself. He shares no history with anyone in our home, has a lifetime of habits and hurts of his own, and has a body that is aging and weary. His words can be hard to decipher, as can his actions. So I'm handing the newspaper from last year back into his hands when his past suddenly becomes my future. I blink to be sure the ink is correct in the corner. Moving my fingers over the date her obituary was published, I point to show him. Drawing a quick breath, I hold it a while longer than perhaps I should. Then I hear my voice speak the truth. That's my birthday. His mother's death was announced on the anniversary of my birth. His mother's passing is old news now, but every birthday in my future will never be the same. This is the moment when his past becomes my present and permanent reality. That's when I knew this wasn't just fostering. This was fulfillment of a destiny. This is forever. And the way forward is to simply continue. So when the stay-at-home order came just a few weeks later, I had peace. I knew we had been purposefully assigned to continue giving care to this man, along with all of our own. To continue giving space in our home and space in our hearts to love and support him through downs or mental illness or grief or anger or loneliness or dementia or a worldwide pandemonia. I hadn't known life would not be unfolding as neatly as the newspaper in my hand. Unprecedented events are unfolding still all around us, and chaos and confusion reign in every headline, but quietly tucked behind all the headlines is the unfolding of destinies. Even when relegated to the back pages of today's news, small and unnoticed actions can leave bold-faced impressions on a life. It's time to put down the paper. The kettle is calling. Good men are rising. And life, in many small ways, continues.